I would like to just kind of dive right into the hard hitting stuff. I think a lot of people have this presumption that colonialism and imperialism are things of the past, and we're in this post colonial era. But there are, of course, different forms and stages to these things. So, as you take a pulse on the plight of Native communities on Turtle Island today, not at all to flatten the diverse histories of all of the different nations, but broadly speaking, what are some of the key elements you'd like to point out in terms of the forms of ongoing colonization that still persist today, even if they're maybe masked by identity politics or more representation, more native voices in mainstream media, in Hollywood, and electoral politics, and so forth?
That's a really good question. And I think in light of the elections that are coming up, one of the things that is sort of an indicator of quality of life is life expectancy. And recently, there have been a number of demographic studies and epidemiological studies that have come out talking about the rapid and sharp decrease in life expectancy of American Indians in particular. And I use that phrase American Indians as a way to sort of distinguish, but also to clarify what I'm talking about in this context, and that encompasses mostly the American Indian nations within the continental United States and those who have sort of federal relations with the United States government, whether that's through treaty or trust responsibilities, etc. Because that's a particular category of people that often gets sort of lumped in within the broader category of indigenous, which I would like to trouble a little bit within the context of colonialism. But it's also, there's Alaska Native people. There's also indigenous people in the Pacific. There are also indigenous people who come from the South and indigenous Africans, et cetera, et cetera. It's a broad encompassing category. And for the sake of this answer, I want to be very specific about those with federal treaty relations or federal relations with the United States government as the sort of settler state, right? Because those life expectancies of that demographic, which the United States is beholden by law to sort of caretake through various sort of land cessions and treaty agreements that they made with these nations, their life expectancy has dropped precipitously. In some instances across the board, it's around like, a drop of like 5.9 years. In the state of South Dakota, where I was born and raised, the average median life expectancy for American Indians, I think, is like between 57 and 59 years old. That's far below even sort of the so-called development, or the developing nations, in the so-called third world or global South. The life expectancy has dropped within the last 2 decades. These studies that have come out have shown that initially epidemiologists thought it was COVID related, but now as the life expectancy continues to drop of American Indians in the United States, they're finding this was a phenomenon that preceded the COVID-19 pandemic, and that continues. And there are a broad array, even that itself sort of obscures the reality on the ground or the socioeconomic and material factors that lead to early death of Native people, right? And so that's, I think, one of the key indicators of what we can call colonialism, not as an afterlife, not as a legacy, but an ongoing reality. And the reason why I'm using the framework of American Indian and federal trust relations is because the Department of Interior is a cabinet level position within the executive. For the first time in our history, we've had a Native and Indigenous woman, American Indian woman, Deb Haaland, as the Secretary of Interior. Huge advancement in terms of representation. And it's also not to say that it's also not to lay at the feet of Deb Haaland's administration the sort of drastic decrease in life expectancy, but it's to show that even with these sort of superficial changes, these deep structural realities of colonialism still weigh heavy on the literal bodies and lands of American Indian people. And I would argue that you could actually trace the early deaths of Native people back to federal Indian policy, the dispossession of lands, the legacies of boarding schools, the stealing away of Native children, the destruction of the American Indian family, the destruction of our culture, the destruction of our language, etc. So going into this electoral cycle, we saw at the DNC, the platforming of American Indians reading a land acknowledgement. I think it was the Potawatomi Prairie Band of Indians that are based in Kansas. They recently got land back in north of Chicago, I believe, and the DNC was held in Chicago, so it was kind of acknowledging that history. And it's not to like take away, from the importance of relaying that sort of reality, that this is stolen land and that these people are originally from here, but it's to show the sort of disconnect where it's like we can acknowledge the sort of absence presence of Native people in these spaces, but yet there's not even a national conversation around why the life expectancy of Native people have dropped so much, right? Or not even, we can't even lay blame at the feet of any sort of institution of power right now, because we're simply dispossessed of these sort of narratives and the structural analysis to understand colonialism as it exists presently within the United States. And one last point I'll make on that is that the Department of Interior selects, the secretary, who holds that office, holds such arbitrary authority over the lives of Native people and our lands and our waters and our resources. That section of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Affairs, is also in the same department that manages wildlife and natural resources. We do not elect Deb Haaland. She is appointed by the President of the United States. The previous one, was appointed by Trump, right? So this isn't, if you want to talk about colonialism, like that, not even having direct participation within the election or the selection of the very person and the very office and the very bureaucrats that control so much of our livelihoods and our destiny and our access to our resources, but also our life chances. So it's that sort of leadership is dictated by somebody who is relatively outside of the authority of our own tribal nation. So that's a very stark sort of example, I should say, but there are others. We can go back into history, but I think it's important to start at the present moment versus just to look in the past to say, well, settler colonialism happened, or dispossession happened, or genocide happened. Imagine the life expectancy of a certain demographic minority within a nation that the United States is at war with, sees itself as a rivalry to, and imagine they had a sharp decrease in life expectancy. The amount of propaganda we would see from the State Department alleging genocide, alleging mistreatment, alleging discrimination. It would be on the news every single day. It would be in the news cycle, but yet we can't even talk about it, nor do we have the frame of reference to even address that issue within the context of the United States.